The Biashara Afrika Forum 2024, a three-day event that commenced on October 9, 2024, is wrapping up in Kigali, Rwanda, and themed Dare to Invent the Future of the AFCFTA. This year's forum seeks to engage the private sector more deeply in trading under the AFCA framework, which is the African Continent of Free Trade Area. With all protocols of the agreement now concluded, 2024 marks a pivotal year for implementation. Member states are expected to accelerate efforts to ensure the effective application of the AFCFTA, particularly by empowering the private sector to take full advantage of the opportunities it has to offer. Biashara Afrika, roughly translated from Swahili as African Business 2024, was also a platform to showcase the second edition of the Gather Trade Initiative, acronym GTI, with over 30 participating state parties from across the African continent, an initiative that aims to drive sustainable and inclusive economic growth through increased intra-trade in the African continent. In that regard, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda has re-echoed a call for the removal of trade barriers across Africa in a bid to facilitate the full implementation of the agreement. Altogether, the forum sought to fast-track the implementation of the agreement and drive Africa's economic transformation. Will African leaders respect this renewed call? Join us in the course of today's edition of Talking Point. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. And in today's edition of Talking Points, we focus on matters pertaining to the African continent. Well, leads us to this Business Africa, or African Business Forum, dubbed Biashara Afrika, which commenced on October 9, 2024, and is expected to culminate today in Kigali, Rwanda, on that theme Dare to Invent the Future of the AFCFTA. And of course, to evoke this day where leaders have called for Africa to scrap off trade barriers, we are being joined in the studio this day by Mr. ACHILE, who is a banker and international financial expert, who all the way from the United States, who used to join us from Zoom, has made his way here to Cameroon. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be part of to be doing this show inside the studio, which is really the first time I'm doing this, and it's very exciting because you have a fantastic studio and people really have to see this. So I'm glad that I made the trip from Washington to here, taking advantage of some vacations to visit family, and so I'm here. I'm glad that you invited me on this show. Thank you so much.
Thank you too for honoring our invitation. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we shall be unpacking a lot as far as today's topic of discussion is concerned. All the way from the US, this time around, we're equally been joined by Dr. STANLEY, FONGOD, a Pan-Africanist who doubles as an economist and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank my co-panelists for joining us as well. I hope we will have a fruitful conversation.
We look forward to a fruitful conversation. To debate with you, Mr. EKEU. Now, when we focus on Biashara Afrika 2024, the business forum that brought together business leaders from across the African continent in Rwanda to discuss on the future of the African continent of free trade area. When you look at the theme of this year, Dare to Invent, or Dare to Invent the Future of the AFCFTA, which is the African Continent of Free Trade Area, what do you understand by that? Could you enlighten our audience as far as the theme of this year's conference or forum was concerned?
Let me give a quick background of this forum. The Biashara 2024 forum is being held in Kigali, and it has renewed calls for removal of trade barriers, right? And the goal here is to allow, after the Continental Free Trade Agreement, to to be effective in a way that people can really feel that commerce is possible, by
within the
removal,
continent.
right, within the continent, because so far we have so much trade barriers. Every country is trying to, preserve whatever they have, but really, if we keep doing this, we're not going to be able to do business, within the continent. So the idea here is to, do away with those trade barriers and allow the continent to trade freely. And President Kagame has stressed that during his opening speech. And so now the theme is there to invent the future of AFTA, which is exactly the point here, meaning that if right now AFTA has been around for so many years now, but it hasn't been effective because so many different countries, are not willing, or maybe the leaders are not, enticed to break down those barriers that are preventing free trade. So we have to figure out a way to strategically do away with those barriers and then do business with it, between us, because otherwise we are going to be depending on the West as the situation is today. We can do it for the next 100 years and nothing's going to change. So if we have to look at the future, which is the theme here, the future should be without any trade barriers, so that we can sell our goods amongst our countries, do commerce, use all the tools that we have, electronic means and all type of ways that people can use payment systems today to pay regardless of where they're buying the products from. So that's how we'll be able to commerce. And if we don't do that, we're going to be stuck for the next 100 years, and then keep blaming other people, keep blaming colonization, keep blaming, but ourselves. So we have to step up, and our leaders have to step up and allow us, and the people of Africa to commerce, to do business, because that's the only way we can be developed. That's how the only way our society could be developed and allow people to get out of poverty, which is a very common, a very important theme. All the time, every year we talk about poverty, but poverty stems from what? We can't do commerce. We have less revenue, and we don't have enough revenue for the population to be able to enjoy, even though they have plenty of resources, under the soil. So that's the idea, and I think the theme is really an important one, and hopefully people are going to heed that call.
Exactly, it's a hope for not just the Rwandan person, but hope for Africans, exactly, for them to see how they can push the African continent forward. Now to you, Dr. FONGOD, you listen to what your co-panelist, Mr. EKEU, had to say as far as the theme of this year's Biashara Afrika Forum is concerned. Now, from your own perspective, what do you have to say about this theme, and how can it push further for the integration, or for this renewed integration which Africa has been dreaming of?
Any kind of renewed integration on the African continent, especially when it comes to AFTA, has to come where we realize that we must deal with trade barriers on the continent. I think without those barriers basically going down, there is no way we can talk about any kind of economic growth. Regional integration, for that matter, will absolutely not be achieved. And reasons being that we will not be able to have, a free economy, so to say, on the continent, where everyone within different species have the capacity to compete within the continent and also outside of the continent. If you look at the continent itself, where we stand, you'll realize that, we average, there's an average, I think, about 9.1% to somewhere around 2.5%, tariffs on African exports, and that is not acceptable. And if you look at, if you compare that to the Western world, it's close to about 2% or 2-point-something%, for other developed nations. But those of us on the continent of Africa, we are facing close to 9.1%. And then there are also non-tariff barriers that we also do face on export products, and this is not helping. This is in areas of licensing, quotas, and cross-border trade. But most countries in the Western world and in developed nations do not face that, because they have robust systems where they actually combat that, just so that they can be able to protect protect whatever is grown locally, small to medium-sized enterprises. They have to protect those areas. So we have to find a way in which we start looking at it, even from an Afrocentric perspective, to help us on the continent of Africa understand that if we do not build our local economies, if we are not able to build our local to medium-sized enterprises, if we are not able to, help our local farmers compete on the continent of Africa with each other, dissolved most of the barriers we have. I mean, if you look averagely, I think it's, I was looking at the numbers a couple of days ago, it's like 12 days averagely for every custom agency on the continent of Africa to be able to clear up any goods. Meanwhile, in the Western world, it's about 4%. And that makes no sense. They will give you papers that have no limit. They will give you all kinds of, just a whole lot of bureaucracy that has nothing to offer, but that in itself basically does not help companies on the continent of Africa to be able to trade with one another. And I think overall we have more trade volume as Africans and African nations with the rest of the world than we have within the continent itself. That is crazy. So we are doing more trade outside of the continent. If you look at small to medium-sized enterprises on the continent of Africa, they are doing more trade, or even countries for that matter, they are actually doing more trade with foreign countries than they are doing within the continent. We have to be able to make sure that we promote local trade, intra-trade within the continent of Africa, and that way we are able to bring ourselves to the place where we are building local companies in Africa, and in that, from that perspective, helping them to be able to create an environment where they are employing this large unemployed population that we do have, as our employment keeps rising. If you look at a country like Nigeria, that's close to about 33%, which is totally unacceptable. We have to push that stuff down to close to at least about 10% and allow people, even those who do not have the skill sets, to be able to have, to be employed, but at least give some kind of training for them as well. This is just the global perspective that we should have, as we're dealing with the issues of trade barriers on the continent, and we must be able to look at this from the continental perspective, not just nation by nation.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Now, to proceed with you, Mr. EKEU. Now, at the heart of this AFCFTA, we have the Guided Trade Initiative, which in some sort, with the contribution of over 30 countries across the African continent, seeks to accelerate the implementation of the African continent of free trade area. Now, from your perspective as an international financial expert, what's your appraisal of the initiative as far as taking the African continent is concerned in terms of sustainable growth and development?
The African Continent Free Trade Agreement, or Free Trade Area, represents a bold step towards economic integration, right, and the development across opportunity for development across the continent. At the heart of this initiative lies the Guided Trade Agreement, the Guided Trade Initiative. So that initiative serves as a practical mechanism to operationalize the AFTA, the AFTA's ambitious goals. So in terms of Pan-Africanism and economic unity, the Pan-Africanism today, as we know it, is a movement advocating for the prosperity and the solidarity between unity among Africans and African nations,
exactly.
Especially emphasizing self-reliance, collective prosperity, and political and economic independence from external influences. So the AFTA, with its vision of a single market for goods and services across Africa, is a contemporary manifestation of these ideals, right? So it seeks to dismantle trade barriers, foster economic cooperation, and promote sustainable development across the continent. So the GTI aligns perfectly with these Pan-Africanist principles by facilitating intra-African trade. It allows African countries to trade selected goods duty-free, thereby reducing reliance on non-African markets and fostering a regional economic interdependence. This initiative not only enhances trade, but also strengthens political ties among African nations, reinforcing the notion of a united Africa. In terms of building regional value chains, the key focus of both AFTA and Pan-Africanism is the development of regional value chains. By encouraging African nations to specialize in different stages of production, these value chains can increase efficiency, create jobs, and boost industrialization. The GTI supports this by selecting products that are integral to regional value chains, such as ceramics, batteries, agricultural products, etc. So this strategic choice helps really build robust industries that are less vulnerable to global fluctuations. Moreover, by promoting trading value added goods rather than raw materials, the GTI encourages industrial growth and diversification. This shift is crucial for Africa's long-term economic development and aligns with Pan-African aspirations for a self-sufficient continent. So in terms of overcoming financial barriers, one of the significant challenges facing intra-African trade is the high cost of cross-border transactions. So the GTI addresses this by incorporating the Pan-African payment and settlement system, PAPS, yes, which facilitates instant payments in local currencies, right? So this system reduces transaction costs and makes it easier for businesses to engage in cross-border trade. So by overcoming financial barriers, the GTI helps unlock Africa's trade potential and supports economic integration. Now, in terms of a catalyst for sustainable development, the GTI is more than just a trade initiative. It is a catalyst for sustainable development across Africa. So by promoting economic integration and cooperation, it lays the groundwork for addressing broader challenges such as poverty alleviation, infrastructure development, and climate change adaptation. These efforts are in line with Agenda 2063, Africa's blueprint for achieving inclusive growth and sustainable development. And to conclude, I would say the Guided Trade Initiative, GTI, is a vital component of the AFTA that embodies Pan-African ideals of unity, self-reliance, and prosperity. By facilitating intra-African trade, building regional value chains, it contributes to Africa's economic renaissance and paves the way for a more integrated and prosperous continent. As Africa continues on this path, initiatives like the GTI will play an essential role in realizing the vision of a united Africa that stands as a dynamic force in the global arena.
Exactly, and it's time for Africa to implement such initiatives for the betterment of the African continent. With you, Dr. FONGOD, you listened to your co-panelist, Mr. EKEU. Now, moving forward, we saw the Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who stated categorically that to move past the stalling challenges that are plaguing the African continent, it was time for Africa to begin with a change of mindset and be also to have some sort of clarity as far as their visions is concerned. And now, when you look at these statements or affirmation made by the president, do you agree that this is really necessary within the African continent, while highlighting the fact that everything boils down to political will?
Of course, I think that it's all about the political will. We have to do whatever it takes on the continent of Africa to make sure that we are taking care of us, that we are taking care of ourselves, which means we need to start finding ways to lower our tariffs, bring that down to close to about 5%. We need to make sure that we streamline whatever non-tariff barriers do exist across the continent so that we can be able to promote, intra-trade, within the continent of Africa. We have to also make sure that we do whatever it takes to expand inter-trade and bring that somewhere around 52%. We need to be able to push that up. One of the things that this will help us achieve, I think my co-panelist was mentioning this, is the fact that we have to find ways in which we bring about some kind of currency cooperation on the continent of Africa. I think that promoting some kind of a regional currency agreement will basically lower income increase in and transaction cost rather, and also increase cross-border liquidity, which is something else that we find extremely quite difficult, achieving across the continent as we speak. Currency convertibility is also a major crisis. Reasons being that only about 38% of the currencies we have on the continent of Africa, you can actually convert that effortlessly. We have to always use the US dollar to settle most of our debts, and that in itself is not helping. Imagine someone who is in a place like Kenya is trying to purchase something from someone in Ghana, and you have to do that. You have to have a third currency that will basically do the conversion for you, which will always be the US dollar. We have to find ways in which we have some kind of a currency on the continent of Africa that is maybe superimpose that currency like a super currency above all other currencies, but we actually maintain we work on our different monetary policies and fiscal policies to ensure that that policy stays powerful, like what we have in Europe, which is basically the euro. We need to be able to have something like that on the African continent, even if we are not fully going to go fully into having a unique currency that all of us use on the continent of Africa, which is quite challenging, because then that means every country must align perfectly with the set economic principles, which it would be in the areas of having monetary and fiscal policies that matches across the board. Otherwise, we'll have issues on our hands that we'll not be able to manage. We need to be able to do that. I think that the political will, that Paul Kagame is talking about is absolutely, necessary. We have to stop thinking mostly about the West in relationship to whatever we want to do on the continent of Africa. And I understand that, if you're going to be a trailblazer in any domain, it's quite challenging, because you're going to be facing things that you've never faced before, because you've never been there before, and there's no metric for you to measure, whatever the outcome will be. We might talk about that from an academic perspective to say that this is what we might see, this is how we might see it, but the reality is we've never been here before. We might be able to run certain models and say that maybe if we do this, this will be the outcome, but the reality is we have to do it, because if we do not do it, I don't know exactly, where we go from here. And we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we do things on the continent of Africa that at first might look crazy or sound crazy to the rest of the world, especially when it comes to us trying to build our local economies and enhance the livelihood of our people, increase our human development index to make sure that the African is quite happy, not just focusing on whatever the GDP might be. So in order for us to be able to achieve this, we might be willing to take certain risk, and to take risk means political will. And I hope that those on the continent of Africa and our leaders on the continent of Africa should be able to understand this. I think that the African Union should be able to set up a think tank that do have the capacity, not just to project certain elements within, whatever the outcome will be when they start talking about us having a free trade area, but to go a little bit further and saying, if we're going to be able to achieve this, there are some key components that we really need to be able to have in place, and that will be whatever fiscal policies, monetary policies we have. That would be to be able to make sure that we enhance, our road infrastructures on the continent of Africa. If you look, we spend close to about 40% on cost alone for every good and services that is being transported across international lines on the continent of Africa, and that in itself is just too costly. So the reality is we don't have the infrastructure. The road infrastructures are not there. Railway lines are not crisscrossing the continent that will actually ease, transportation of goods and services. We have to be able to make sure that we work on that. If you were going to leave a place like Yaoundé, Douala, Ghana, Accra, Ghana, Nairobi, Kenya, and you were flying to any of these countries on the continent, cities on the continent of Africa, it is far more costly than you leaving any of these cities and heading to Europe. Absolutely. That in itself is totally unacceptable. We must be able to make sure that we work on our infrastructure. We do whatever it takes, whether it be on a telecom sector or just road network. We have to make sure that we increase on that, so we can be able to drop down, the cost of production, and eventually reduce prices in the market.
And indeed, it's often said that Africa needs to work on itself and, of course, organize things within the continent of Africa for it to be able to be seen as that great continent at the global level. Now, Mr. EKEU,
yes,
earlier on you mentioned the Pan-African payment system, which we know is yet to get into full force within the African continent since its launch with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But then, I'd like to reiterate a statement made by President Paul Kagame. He highlighted, which was what you equally mentioned in your appreciation or appraisal of the Guided Trade Initiative, which is the importance of Africans collaborating amongst themselves. In as much as we have this shared history, shared culture, shared vision, we should be able to work together to leverage these things we share in common for us to be able to take the African continent forward in terms of economic growth and development. When you look at some of these values, do you really agree with me that the issue of solidarity is still lagging behind on the African continent? Because yet we keep talking about taking the continent forward. We talk about the African continent, a free trade area, up to date. We are having all the African continent, all the countries on the African continent that are yet to fully implement this agreement. So, would you say there's this lack of solidarity within the continent of Africa?
Well, we can't discount what the role of colonization in this whole business. You know, my co-panelists mentioned infrastructure earlier. You know,
exactly.
Roads, railways, things like that. And you know how those people did about those infrastructure. They did this very, very, very bad. You know, they come, for example, in Cameroon, they build a railway that has a different dimension in terms of space between the rails, than the one in Gabon, in Senegal, and things like in Cote d'Ivoire. So a train cannot leave Cameroon and get to Gabon or to Cote d'Ivoire straight. So because those rails in those countries have different dimensions.
Exactly.
And then and same thing for roads, something for a train. It's unacceptable, so they did that on purpose so that look at the CFA franc. That's another one. How are we going to commerce between people from the Central African region with people in the West African region using the same currency, but they're not exchangeable? You have a Central African currency, CFA. You have to go and exchange it to get a euro, and then again change that euro to the West African CFA franc. How is that possible? The same nation, France, who created that currency, but they have different values in different regions, and they're not acceptable.
Maybe
they're not interchangeable.
That could have been a strategy.
It is a strategy. That's what I mean. That's the point. It's all strategies, all well thought out. So we don't trade enough between us, and so it's structural. At core, it's very structural at core. But our goal today, using the tools that we have today, NAFTA and GTI, is to reverse that. And using electronic means nowadays, technology, we can reverse that. But still, we're still going to need those infrastructure. So we need to get together and build those high roads, highways, big railways that can go from the northern part of Africa to the southern part of Africa, and it has to go across the continent also, and so that trade is possible. And it's one of the things that we need to do. We have to be careful, choose which companies we're going to choose. When we remember Sonara in Cameroon, right?
Yes.
So the French they were hired to build a Sonara so that we can refine our oil, right? Guess what? They put Sonara without the tools or the mechanism that's going to refine our oil. They said our oil is too thick, it's not a good oil, it's this and that we have to send our oil to Europe to be refined, and then
it comes back at very high prices.
Guess what? That's exactly the kind of stuff that if we don't supervise, we don't make sure that we are watching what they're doing, we're going to be screwed again many times. So we have to figure out which companies, we have to give those projects to, and then monitor the effectiveness of the way they're building it to the standard that we're looking for. That way, those infrastructure are going to fully benefit us. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation where, they build, in different parts of the continent for the same highway, different standards, and then we start having issues. So infrastructure is key, and one of the key also things that we need to do about infrastructure is internet. We have to have high speed, high speed internet everywhere in the continent, because traveling the continent with GPS, traveling the continent for trade, it's critical today. You have those big trucks that go from, I live in the U.S. I guess my co-partners live in the U.S. too. So we know the distances that those trucks travel, right? So you should be able to monitor those trucks. If you have a trucking company, you should be able to monitor your trucks, see where they are, and then make sure that they're not in a position where you can't monitor them. So internet should be all across the continent, and those are the other things that we need to put in place to be able to have free trade, because trade means using technology for different purposes, for a variety of purposes that are critical to being successful in trading. So we need to really, work on this. Use this guided trade initiative to really come around and put strategies effectively and look for companies or partners that are going to help us build these roads, build these railways, and so we can do business in a way that is appropriate to the level, to the needs of our populations, because our populations, they have needs. Some parts of the continent have so much food, and some other parts
do not have.
They don't have enough, and so we need to be able to move those goods from one place to another easily in a way that could keep the good still in good health. That way, people who are going to be buying those goods are not buying poor quality products. So, same thing with planes, right? So, all this infrastructure, we have to work on that. And I guess we have to focus on now building those infrastructure, put those infrastructure in place so that the trade is possible. Otherwise, it's going to be a dream.
A dream which we hope is going to be materialized, not the dream of Africa actually progressing. But you mentioned something, I'd like to stay with you, Mr. EKEU.
Yes, that's right.
The issue of Africa and a common currency. If we are still discussing this issue of economic integration within the continent of Africa, it's still because in as much as the African Union highlighted it was imperative for Africa to have a single currency, we're yet to get to that point. Right. With an initiative like the Guided Trade Initiative, for instance, of the African Union under the African Continental Free Trade Area, do you see the feasibility or see the issue of Africa having a common currency actually coming to fruition, like it materializing within the continent?
Well, that's the goal. And that's part of the Agenda 2063,
exactly.
as outlined in that document, by the African Union vision, So it's that's the goal. We've tried. One of our leaders was killed because of him, trying to put in place those tools, that single currency. And here we talk about Colonel Gaddafi. Colonel Gaddafi was killed because of he wanted to put together an African bank, some type of African Development Bank, something like that, and then an international African fund, something like that. So I'm not exactly sure about the terminology, but one would be in Yaoundé, the other one would be in Nigeria, Central Bank in Nigeria, and African Monetary Fund in Cameroon, in Yaoundé, and so that was the goal. So. The West jumped on the occasion and thought that it was going to threaten their interests. CFA people, people in France not very happy to hear things like that, and people in the US not happy too. So, so they decided to coalesce around around that purpose and destroy that country. Now Libya nowadays is a shell of itself, right? So, exactly. And this is caused by destruction of people who are looking to keep Africa, in a situation where we are just a continent that is living, surviving but consuming Western products. They don't want us to really be free,
independent.
Independent, in a way that really we control everything, all our resources and everything. So they want to have a say on that, and that way. But I think it's time for us to use many of our opportunities that we have today. The BRICS, the BRICS country could be a way to find strategies to build an African currency that could really help us trade, amongst ourselves, because one of the things about trade is currency, right? If you have so many different currencies. We have 54 countries, 54 currencies or whatever. It's going to be crazy. But as long as we can trade within the continent with those currencies, it's going to be fine to a certain point. But so having one big currency for the whole continent will help a great deal, easing all these currency exchanges fee, all these fees transaction fees,
exactly.
Right, exchange rate, transaction fees, things like that. So that will help a great deal, and that will help bring down a lot of situation that we see today, where people have goods in one part, they can send them to some of the parts that are really in need of those goods. So, but the key infrastructure is important. Currency is critical also, and our government, the will of our government also is also critical. So it's a whole system that has to be put in place, that we need to believe in, that we need to trust, that we need to build, and we have to make sure that they are functioning the way they're supposed to function without any interference.
Exactly, Mr. EKEU, just to highlight that Africa needs to put all the parameters in place for them to be able to move towards the shared goal and vision,
right,
which you have brilliantly highlighted. Now, to you, Dr. FONGOD, you listened to your co-panelists who did not fall short in highlighting that it's important for Africa to have a single currency, but equally, if Africa needs to cooperate amongst themselves, African countries, so to say, it's imperative for them to be able to create some sort of a platform where they can be able to commerce amongst themselves with their different currencies. Now, simultaneously, we saw the leaders at the Biashara Afrika Forum that highlighted it was key for them to be able to invest in small and medium-sized enterprises, which, you agree with me, it's some sort of the backbone in driving investment and development across the African continent. With this implementation, do you believe that the African continent is headed towards some sort of financial freedom?
Well, financial freedom, for that matter, will come when we really do have a currency of our own. Financial freedom will come when the sub-Saharan African region, especially Black Africa, do have some kind of a bond market, a capital market, because we don't have that capital funding for small to medium-sized enterprises, and even for young entrepreneurs, do not exist in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can go to any bank in sub-Saharan Africa and request that you need funding to set up a business or to run something, and the requirements they will give you, if you had that requirement, you will not be coming to the bank in the first place. So these are some of the challenges we are facing, and so every now and then you have the EU will come out with something like Agenda 2063, when we can start talking about having a single currency on the continent of Africa, which to me is just a scam. And the reason for that is because his men like Gaddafi understood that we needed to have a currency way back then, before he got assassinated, a currency that was going to be backed by gold, like what we have done at CROSTON FINTECH, having a digital currency that is backed by gold. That is the only way in which Africa actually emerges out of this darkness. Reasons being, the United States of America is only as good as the petrodollar. Without the petrodollar, there will be no United States, period. This country can do whatever it wants to do. A couple of billions here going to Gaza, a couple of billions to Ukraine, billions to Israel. They can do whatever they have to do. They can spend the money anyhow they have to spend the money. They can print it any way they want to print the money. But to have some kind of a currency on the continent of Africa that is legitimate. We must have a currency that is backed by a commodity, and we have a lot of commodities on the continent of Africa that the world is in need of. But there's one commodity that has stood the test of time, and this will be gold. Gold in itself is in its intrinsic value. It's so good that even when the decentralized platform in the cryptocurrency space came along, with blockchain space came along, they had to institute this component within it called mining, and that was as a result of gold. And the reason is because, there's no alchemy for gold, but there is an alchemy for metals, for things like precious stuff like diamond. You can actually have a fake diamond. It's called mesorite. You can actually have a fake diamond, but you will never have fake gold. Gold is gold. You cannot produce gold in the laboratory, which means that for money to be legitimate and for money to basically stand the test of time, money is not something that you can mass produce. You cannot do that. And so if you have something like the dollar or CFA, whatever, that you just keep printing and printing and printing, obviously as you print the value of the currency that somebody is holding basically drops as a result of the fact that you're flooding the market with all these bills. And that is the problem we are facing either with the dollar or most of the currencies that we do have on the continent of Africa. If we have a currency on the continent that is backed by a commodity, e.g. gold, that I think will be the best possible thing that can happen to us, and I think it's achievable. We have all the gold in the world on the continent to do whatever we want to do, and I think that this is the way in which Africans should be looking at this, and we don't have to wait. Okay, I don't think that anyone is sitting around waiting for Agenda 2063. And nobody's waiting for that garbage. We have heard that those benchmarks, but in the end, nothing to show for it. Secondly, I do believe that if we are able to have a current currency, and we talked about the issues of cross-border trade, and also trying to talk about cost of doing business across international borders, especially with exchange rates and remittance fees, whatever methods of payment, and however we are sending out these payments, we need to be able to make sure that we have our own currency, so that when somebody is in Johannesburg, South Africa, trying to sell someone who is trying to sell something to somebody in Cotonou, there's no ambiguity in terms of what they're getting. They're getting what they're getting, because what they're getting is the same value, same currency. Nobody is basically thinking anything else. You don't have to start, doing all the math in terms of the exchange rate, remittance fees, and whatever you have to do. You're just selling. It's like you've been in the United States of America. We have 50 states. I live in Los Angeles. My co-partners, I think, lived in Maryland. You don't have to worry about, if I was going to do any kind of business with him, nobody cares about where we are. The reason is because we're in this particular country but different states, and our transactions are seamless. We just have to pay for whatever our shipping cost might be for me to receive whatever I'm receiving from him, or him to receive whatever I'm sending to him. But the cost of doing business is pretty much known, and every small to medium-sized enterprise needs to understand this, and we need to be able to make sure that small to medium-sized enterprises on the continent of Africa can actually do business in Africa. And how do they grow if they can't do business in Africa? Because we have all these limitations, tariffs, exchange rate issues, currency conversions, madness, but and also on the fact that there's no funding. All right, and that there's no funding for them. So we have to go to make sure that at least the little that we have for them, we encourage them within that space. But for God's sake, we need to have our own currency, and that currency better be backed by gold.
Yeah, Dr. FONGOD, I listened. You said it's imperative for Africa to have a currency that is backed by gold, which is in line with what your co-panelists had stated, citing countries within even the BRICS group of emerging economies. When you look at the African continent, let's focus back on Biashara Afrika. These leaders are saying that they're going to invest in small and medium-sized enterprises, which is virtually the private sector in the continent. It's true the private sector is growing because they create jobs, which is in line with what your co-panelist has stated earlier. But with all this in mind, you believe that this sector within Africa is really ready to embrace the opportunities that will come with the African continent of free trade area?
I think that, of course, I think that there is a lot of opportunities in that space. We have lived in a continent where we have a lot of a colonial legacy, kind of madness, where you have the federal government, whatever governments we have in our own, whatever government we have in our different African nations, becoming the largest employer. And if you look at most of governments, they are not for profit. There's no government in this world that is for profit, not even the federal government in the United States. Every government, they spend, they're in the business of spending. They run like an NGO with an unlimited amount of funding. So for us to be able to build up a robust economy, we need to be able to have the private sector do what the private sector does. And the private sector is where there is innovation, all right, where someone with an idea can be able to get into business and build up something so powerful, like people like Elon Musk, people like Dangote, men who are in the private sector who do what they do, and then in that light, bring a lot of people on board by creating other millionaires within the space, or bringing people to work, in terms of employment. One of the problems we have in Africa is the fact that there is no capital. So when we are talking about trying to bring funding to small to medium-sized enterprises, I'm wondering how we're going to do that, because I've heard this talk over and over and over again. African Development Bank, for example, we do talk about how we're trying to go to build something as small yet significant like a data center, where we can be able to store our own data on the continent of Africa. We have gotten into the age of AI, all right, and one of the things that we do at CROSTON FinTech is actually work on AI applications. And if you know anything about AI, the reality is, excuse me, the models that are being trained right now are being trained on information that we have no control over. So you're going to have an AI system that will spew out information about the continent of Africa that does not reflect our values, our traditions, and our norms. And the reason for that is because we are not participating in the building process. And so we do not have enough data, we do not have enough information, we are not putting that in. And of course, anybody who is building this thing in the West is more focused on the West. They are not thinking about you who is on the continent of Africa. It's the same mindset that we have, especially when it comes to mining and this whole entire environmental friendly stuff. In the West, we can talk about going green, the Green New Deal. We can talk about all this garbage. We talk about trying to become green. I am not saying garbage because I am, against going green. I'm saying garbage because on the continent of Africa, going green means dying. And what do I mean by that? You have most of the mineral resources that is needed by the West to go green. We are talking about things like lithium. We are talking about things like cobalt. Those things are needed out here in the West for the green revolution in terms of, green environment and clean air and all of that, clean energy. The West needs that, but that is at a deadly expense to the African. And if you see what's happening in most mining areas across the continent with the aggressive methods of mining, where you have Chinese companies that do come in and destroy almost everything that we have, so that long after they have stopped mining, no one can farm in that particular environment because of the hard minerals, mercury, and all kinds of toxic waste that leaves, in the aftermath of these mining expeditions, that leaves the African, to be exposed to cancer and all kinds of illnesses. This is taking place right now in places like the DRC, in neighborhoods in Nigeria and Ghana and Cameroon, in places like Betty in the eastern part of the country. We have to be able to do whatever it takes to make sure that we start thinking about Africa, whether this be in building small to medium-sized enterprises, and asking ourselves questions like, where do we get our funding from and who is responsible for actually giving us the funding? Because most likely whoever gives us the funding determines the terms of the funding and what we can actually do with the funding. I was talking about the African Development Bank talking about building data centers. What that means is, if we are going to actually streamline and have a robust infrastructure on the continent of Africa, where those within the inner cities and in the villages can be able to participate in the global market, which means they need to be on the internet and actually sell a product or maybe work online. We need to have these infrastructures like what Elon Musk is, Elon Musk STANLEY is doing right now in many parts of the continent. We have to be able to make sure that we have a data center that harbor our information, our data, so that we can be able to know what is going on the African continent, what our children are being exposed to, who is bringing what to the continent. If you look at companies like Facebook, companies like Google, they spend $0 in the continent of Africa in relationship to taxes, because no one is basically holding anyone responsible. And the only way for us to actually put some kind of a meter where we say, you know what, this is what your tax, this is how much you're going to pay in taxes, you know, for all the billions you are making on the continent of Africa, Facebook, I mean, all the social media platforms. We need to be able to have data centers that do have the capacity to do that. Without the data center, there is absolutely nothing we can do. So in all of our talks about 2063 and, you know, funding small to medium-sized enterprises, I think that there are certain things that we need to be able to do that will be able to help the continent and help, you know, countries on the continent of Africa to get the money that they are leaving on the table when it comes to taxes, to be able to help small to medium-sized enterprises actually grow in the areas and in the domain that is their competence, not just giving money to people to do whatever they want to do because someone in the West is saying so. Let us build what we need with Africa in mind, Africans, you know, with Africa in mind, with Africans at the helm doing the building. We don't have to bring people from anywhere to do it. We are left with railway station tracks on the continent of Africa that came from the colonial era, and the reasons why each country has a different metric is because back then different European countries had different metrics in terms of, you know, their railway size, and that's what they imported to us on the continent of Africa, and that's what we are facing right now. So by the time they basically had some kind of you know, regulation that allowed for different tracks to be able to travel across different European countries, we were still stuck with whatever we're given to by our colonial masters, and that's what we're experiencing on the continent of Africa now, which means the colonial legacy has not left us. We have to do whatever it takes to stand and fight to push ourselves out of that shadow so that we can begin to experience some kind of freedom. And I hope we start that by, you know, having the just, you know, the sheer will to be able to go against whatever the oppositions might be, becoming Africans, thinking about Africa from an Afrocentric perspective.
The goal is taking Africa from an Afrocentric perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. I'll be coming back to you, Mr. EKEU, because there is one thing you both have in common, having a single currency. But Dr. FONGOD says a single currency needs to be backed by gold. Before we get to uncovering the new strides which we need to bring on the ground, on the platform for Africa to be able to achieve the Africa I want, I would like us to take a brief break where we shall be able to get an excerpt cut from the speech of the Rwandan President Paul Kagame as far as Biashara Afrika is concerned and taking the African continent forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll listen to this excerpt. When we come back, we shall be proceeding with our analysis in the course of today's edition of Talking Point.
Our commitment to the economic unity and prosperity of Africa. Indeed, Africa is capable of coming together to solve our own problems. But of course, I want to urge our leaders also to make sure that some of the things that stand in our way, that are actually not too difficult to address, should not continue to be the case. We need to fix our politics, our governance. And it all begins with mindset and clarity of vision. Like when people talk about AFCFTA and intra-African trade, how low it is, and so on and so forth, The first thing that comes to mind is lack of free movement. Why should there be anything like that? Why shouldn't there be free movement of people, goods and services? Why? Why shouldn't people of one country freely move across the border to another country, across the whole continent? What is the issue? In the end, we agree we are brothers and sisters and same people that have same needs. But in the end, the lack of this freedom of people to move freely, well, I'm talking about moving freely across borders. Some people don't move freely within their own borders.
That was the Rwandan President Paul Kagame speaking on his speech as far as Biashara Africa is concerned, highlighting that it's imperative to have free movement of people, goods and services within the continent of Africa. We're proceeding this edition of Talking Points, and as with me here is Mr. ACHILE, who is an international financial expert and banker. Now, from what we stopped, we cited that it's imperative for Africa to have a single currency backed by commodity. We equally highlighted that it's imperative for Africans to be able to move freely, irrespective of the challenges in terms of infrastructure, which you cited earlier, say from Cameroon to Gabon, the infrastructural developments. It's actually very different. Now, with that in mind, what fresh ideas need to be brought to the table for Africa to actually get to that point where it wants to be? Because we're advocating for the Africa we want, but what exactly is Africa we want? What new ideas can we bring to the table?
Well, I wanted to piggyback on what my co-panelists mentioned earlier about the green energy. So I think he has a point because we are at a stage where we need to put in place infrastructure to develop, to get ourselves out of this situation that we've been living in for years due to colonization, slavery, colonization and stuff. So when it's our turn to build those infrastructure, they call us in Paris and they start creating those climate change, whatever initiatives, and then preventing us from, using our resources, our natural resources, to build our infrastructure. And China did that. I mean, the West started with that. That's how they got developed. America did the same thing. China did the same thing. Now, when it comes to Africa, people don't want us to use our resources because they feel like, oh, pollution, listen, we are going to pollute the world. Well, I would say we have to strike a balance. I mean, we can strike a balance. We can still use our resources and still meet some basic, environment standards, because I mean, who's polluting the most in this world? Those big countries, right?
Exactly.
So, but why are they asking us to pay the same price as them? And we know today this is all hypocrisy. I mean, the war on Ukraine started, right? They sanctioned Russia, and Russia, I mean, they cut the pipeline, that gave oil or gas or energy to Germany and to the whole European organization. And so what happened is that they started going back to using coal.
Yes. And
if they start using coal, for them it's okay. But for us to use our own natural resources,
they're destroying the environment.
Exactly. It's all hypocrisy, and I think we have to go beyond that and stop, trying to use their own. We have to create our own standard in Africa. Why can't we create our own standards? Why are we always going to have to follow other people's standards? No, we have to stop that. And the political will is important, as mentioned by President Kagame here. People have to travel. People have to move between different countries and do away with all these restrictions, visa and all that stuff. I mean, it's ridiculous. those small, we have small countries most of the time. You know, very few countries are big. Even when they're big, their population is just small. So why are we not allowed to travel between Cameroon and Gabon? We need a visa. What kind of nonsense is that? We need a visa to go to Gabon, you need a visa to go to Congo, you need a visa to go to, you know, X, Y, and Z. It's ridiculous, right? So, and we know that the population living in those countries are the same people. And those, you know, those frontiers that we have, you know, they're just, you know, fake frontiers that were designed out of, you know, the interests of the West. But they're not real frontier because people, you know, we have the same people living in Gabon, in Cameroon, in Congo, and things like that. In Nigeria, we have people, the same people living in Nigeria, in Cameroon, you know. So it's not necessary to have visa. You know, you have to do with all these. That's what President Kagame is talking about, doing away with all these restrictions that are preventing people from moving. You know, moving their goods, moving their services across different countries, and now coming back to the gold, about the currency. That you know, the currency being backed by gold. Well, it's important to use gold because gold has always been the commodity of choice for currency, and you know gold today is estimated to be around 2,600. You know, gold still increasing. It's an asset that doesn't you know, it doesn't devalue. It goes up all the time. It's a refuge. It's an asset of you know, of reference where you know, people go to be able to determine the value of it. So having a currency backed by gold is good. But what has happened, what we've seen in Zimbabwe with the ZIC that has been going through some difficulties recently, is a specific issue that is in Zimbabwe that prevents the ZIC from being really used, you know, across the country. And the issue here is that there is a situation where the U.S. dollar, is still being used under the market, you know, in the black market there, and so we have an official currency, the ZIC, that is backed by gold, but you know, in the black market, the US dollar is still being used by a good swath of the population there. Okay. And so this dual track is going to be detrimental to the ZIC, and hence the fact that there's a devaluation of 40% of the ZIC against itself and 70% against the dollar. Means that it's no longer being gold as the standard that they're using. It's the dollar that they're using as a standard, and that's not good, because that could kill that currency and make it be like the other currencies that they used to have in the past, and that was being devaluated, you know, many times and then lost so much value. So they have to be very careful in that, and some advice for them would be to really try to do away, you know, slowly. Even though the population likes the U.S. dollar, they have to work very hard to educate the population that, hey, you know, it's for our own interest to use our own currency, you know, that's backed by our own commodities, our own resources, our own natural resources, instead of relying on the U.S. dollar, because you rely on U.S. dollar exposes Zimbabwe to more sanctions. Exactly. It exposes Zimbabwe prevents Zimbabwe from doing business with companies that the U.S. have sanctioned. So I mean, plus the extraterritoriality law that was passed, that is effective in the U.S. You know, I mean, those sanctions are being applied to Zimbabwe through those extraterritoriality laws that were passed in the U.S. Congress a few years ago. So we have to. They have to find a way to do away with the dollar in a way that the population is not going to feel the pain. Do it slowly, but you know, make sure that, you know, they can get the population to really trust the ZIC. Otherwise, you know, it may be doomed. But we don't want to think about, you know, it that way. But I think they're going to make the necessary change so that we don't see that kind of devaluation happening again. Okay. Now, I'd like to change the wheel and take us to a different direction. You cited Zimbabwe. We know the sanctions that the country has went in recent years. But away from that, while we are talking about Africa having a single currency, right, and getting towards economic independence, towards having a united Africa, do you believe that economic independence is actually feasible, and how can Africa move towards that direction? Well, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge.
Definitely.
Because the West is not going to sit by idle. They're going to sit by idle and watch.
Exactly.
You know, we already heard Donald Trump saying that anybody that ditches the dollar is going to be sanctioned, as they've never felt before. So they're not going to sit idle and sit by idle and just watch us, do business. So we have to fight on several fronts. And this is where political will is going to matter, because if we don't have leaders that are really Pan-African, Pan-Africanist leaders at core, we are going to be suffering those situations where, even though one leader could take a good decision, the next one that comes in through election can counteract, and then everything falls apart. So it's going to be challenging, but it's a goal we need to achieve. We need to figure out. And for me, the embryo, the embryo for this is the Sahelian countries, right? The 3 Sahelian countries look to me like a place where things can get started. They're not there yet, but if they come up with their own currency, hopefully very soon, then we're going to see how they manage it in a way that that is acceptable, that is according to
the
norms, standards of managing currencies. If they can manage that well, and people feel comfortable, or the countries or the people in the continent feel comfortable, maybe they could be people can slowly start joining those signing country, and maybe that could be the place where the unity of the continent starts. Whether it's currency related or defense related, because in the defense side they're also buying so many weapons, and they're very powerful nowadays. I mean, those armies are really very experienced. They have the tools, they have all kind of weapons that the West have refused to sell them in the past, that they are acquiring now from different parts of the world, China, Russia, Turkey, and so exactly. So the African continent, single currency is going to be a challenge, but we can do it. If the political will is there, if we find the best strategy, the right strategy that's going to matter, that's going to fit us, that will help. And especially, these BRICS. I come back to the BRICS again. One of the key things about being part of the BRICS is that it liberates us from just having one partner. We have different partners now, right? So we can hear different sounds, different advice from different people. We have different products that we can test, we can try, and different partners that give us, different solutions to our needs. So we can use that, we can leverage that to really push away those partners that have been there for the longest time, the colonial powers, push them away, and then bring in new partners that are going to help us build our economy, build our currency, sustain those currency in a way that that will not be, that not be, let's say, damaged by the West. I'm talking about, for example, the Guinea president who said no to de Gaulle, right? He said no to de Gaulle. Guess what? The French started dumping fake currency in the economy to destroy the economy, right?
Indeed.
So we don't want that happening in the single African currency too. So we need to figure out how to protect that currency, at the same time, make sure that we don't be we're not in a position where we are going to be threatened by the West, because they're going to try to destroy our economy. So we've seen that with Zimbabwe, we've seen that in many other countries. But there's a strategy that we need to put in place to prevent it from happening. Right.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over For You Media Africa. You're watching us on For You Television and listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. And of course, we're streaming live on our social media platforms. Today, we focus on Biashara Afrika Forum 2024, where there's this renewed call for African leaders to scrap off trade barriers across the African continent. Now, as we're gradually coming to the end, Dr. FONGOD, we've seen a beautiful forum, a very healthy one in terms of bringing to the table ways in which Africa can boost economic growth and development. But moving forward, do you believe that the resolutions from these forum are actually going to be implemented within the continent of Africa?
I don't think that there will be any kind of legitimate change as long as we keep doing what we have always done, and we keep having all of these beautiful meetings and coming out with powerful resolutions and giving them names and then re-echo them, across the continent in whatever smaller meetings we go to, sounding very promising, but the reality is that with no action, nothing gets changed. So what I'm looking for is if we were going to have some folks on the continent of Africa who are willing to step up. I think that my co-panelists mentioned those guys in the Sahel. I think that they are stepping up. They're doing whatever it takes to be able to make sure that they change the status quo and let us begin to enjoy something that we have not enjoyed before. That being said, I think I'm still a big-time believer that we need to be able to have our own currency and back that currency with a commodity. That currency would go. Zimbabwe, it's going through intense issues, and one of the problems in Zimbabwe is the fact that the currency that they have in Zimbabwe, they peg that currency would go, but the idea for the goal is whatever is the cluster abundance of the gold that they have in Zimbabwe. I think that the only way this thing works is when we have mineable gold. Number one, we also have to understand that we are going to have a lot of issues trying to be able to respond to any kind of economic shocks that might exist so far as the world economy is concerned, where the rule of thumb is always to print more money and inject into the economy whenever there's any kind of an economic issue or economic shock across the world. We've seen that happen during the pandemic in 2020 in the United States of America. We saw that happening in 2008 in the housing crisis in the US, where they just print money and then inject that. We need to be able to have a way in which we allow our economy to somehow correct themselves. And I think that if we just step aside and allow, the economy to correct itself, there will not be any issue. That being said, that does not take away from us responding to humanitarian issues that may arise. Maybe we need to be able to give people food or, help other companies that are too big to fail, which to me doesn't even make any sense, because if you are in the marketplace, then you are in for every single thing that the marketplace has to offer. But we can't be able to find out which companies maybe is hiring a lot of people, and then to be able to support that particular company, but then get the money back, as they become profitable. So what I'm trying to say is this, that irrespective of whatever we are facing, we still need a currency on the continent of Africa that is our own currency, and that currency still stands. Please let that currency be backed by a commodity. We might have to change most of our fiscal policies and monetary policies to be able to adjust to this new way of thinking, because with the fiat system, where the government just basically comes and tell you that this is what their money is worth and they can do whatever it takes, and then that's what it is. I think that we have looked a lot to the West. We have looked too long to the West to see exactly how they're printing money left and right. And the only reason why they're doing so is because there is something called the petrodollar. Almost all financial monetary reserved in the world is in the dollar, because that is the currency of exchange. And so it's probably about almost 60-70% of the world currency reserve for exchange is actually the US dollar. So that means that they can do whatever they have to do because they have that cushion. If you took that away, the U.S. economy actually collapses, period. You cannot print the amount of money this nation is printing to, for whatever humanitarian or non-humanitarian or whatever political thing they're doing across the world. You cannot push that amount of money and actually think that an economy would survive. That being said, I'm optimistic that there is a brighter future for us on the continent of Africa. I'm optimistic that we can do whatever it takes as Africans. I think that the top scientists, top researchers, are Africans, working in major multinational companies, across the world. There's an African leading somewhere across the globe. And if we're able to harness those minds and bring them back to the continent of Africa and then consult and find ways in which we can be able to integrate what they know to build up what we need to build on the continent of Africa, that will be to the advantage of the African. And that will be the kind of solidarity that we need so far as the African is concerned. I stand with Paul Kagame. There's no reason why I should not be be able to go to Rwanda, South Africa without needing a visa. As an African, no African country has the right to deny me the right to be able to travel on my continent as an African with no restrictions. Let there be visa restrictions to Europe. Let there be visa restrictions to Asia. Let there be visa restrictions to the America, but not to another African on the continent of Africa. I think it's a shame. I have the right to go wherever I want so far as I'm on the continent of Africa. That's my birthright. And I think that we have to be able to embrace that and shame our political elites, to submission. That being said, I think I'm quite optimistic as to where we go, and I think the future is bright.
The future is bright indeed for the African continent. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. To wrap up this edition of Talking Point, and I'll give the floor to you, Mr. EKEU. Now, chatting the way forward, your co-panelists have stated that it's imperative for Africans to work together to have a borderless Africa. But what do you advise the African continent to do from here in just 1 minute so we can be able to conclude today's topic of discussion?
Well, we have to stay focused. We have to believe in ourselves. That's the key. No one is going to come and develop our continent for us.
Absolutely.
So that's pretty much what I have to say here. We have to believe in ourselves. We have to do what we need to do. We have to stop hoping, start getting aid. That word just drives me nuts. Getting aid. We're hoping they're going to get aid from here and there. All these programs to aid our continent to develop it's insane. It's ridiculous. So we have to believe in ourselves. We have to put together all the different small differences that we have that were created by colonial masters to divide us, and then come together in unity and develop this continent. We have the resources, whether it's natural resources, we have the human resources, we have the expertise in every aspect of life today. Africans are performing. They have the resources, they have the main power, they have the brain power, they have everything to be able to do what they need to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. ACHILE, a CEO of investment bank called the Washington Valuation Group, and equally the author of the book From Beginner to Pro. Ladies and gentlemen, he took part in today's edition. We will not go without acknowledging the brilliant contribution equally of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist, an economist, and equally a CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we believe you learned a lot from today's conversation. I've been NJIX NABESEH for presentation to stay in company of our numerous programs.